Social reaction theory. This is a body of theory that emerges or gains popularity in the 1960s, and it shifts the focus from the offender, from the deviant actor, to people or institutions who are responding or reacting to offenders by labeling them, punishing them, stigmatizing them, trying to control them. This is a body of theory that's grounded in symbolic interaction theory. If you recall from Introduction to Sociology, symbolic interaction theory is a body of theories that are microsociological. They focus on primarily on face-to-face interactions, but the symbolic interaction theories typically are focused on the meanings, symbolic meanings. And here specifically with labeling theory, we're looking at the symbolic meanings of labeling. What is the process by which a person is labeled as a deviant or a criminal? And what are the consequences of having labeled the person as a deviant or criminal? So think of the consequences in your life if you had a criminal conviction, a felony conviction on your record. How would this impact you? This might make it more difficult for you to obtain a job, to get along with people who would prefer not to interact with convicted criminals and so forth. It could have a powerful influence on your life having been labeled as a convicted criminal. So labeling theory looks at how people get labeled as deviant and the consequences of that. This derives from the relativity of deviance perspective that I presented in the very beginning of the course. And if you recall, the argument here was that no act is inherently deviant. It does not become deviant until other people respond to it and label it as deviant. Furthermore, some behaviors might be considered deviant in the United States, but perfectly acceptable in another country, or vice versa. Some behaviors that are considered deviant in the United States today might have been acceptable 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or vice versa. So whether or not an act is labeled as deviant is relative to your location, your historical time period, your social status in society, and so forth. Labeling theorists are interested in this because they're asking, why are some people labeled as deviant and other people are not labeled as deviant? It's fairly well established that all of us commit deviant acts from time to time. All of us commit criminal acts, and most of us have probably committed a felony at some point in our life. You might not think of yourself as a felonious criminal. You're probably not a convicted felon, but there is probably something that you have done. Maybe you bought cigarettes for a minor, or you borrowed a car without asking permission, or you took money out of your mother's purse without asking permission. Technically, things like these are felonies. So from this perspective, all of us are felons. Labeling theorists are asking, why do only some people get labeled as felons, and what are the consequences of that? Labeling theorists distinguish between primary deviance and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is the initial deviant act that you commit that causes you to become labeled as a deviant. Secondary deviance is deviance that is a consequence of having been labeled. So let's say I've received a felony conviction, and this makes it difficult for me to get a job. And because I can't get a job, I have financial strain, and perhaps I commit a crime because of that financial strain, because I couldn't get a job because I was labeled as a felon. If you follow that chain of consequences, my second crime could be a consequence of having been labeled a felon for my first crime. Another aspect of secondary deviance is that sometimes people can internalize the deviant label. If everybody in society is telling me that I'm a criminal, I'll begin to think of myself as a criminal, and perhaps having developed a self-concept as a criminal as a consequence of having been labeled, that might make me more likely to commit criminal acts in the future. Note here that labeling theory has something in common with differential association theory, routine activities theories, and a few other theories, in that it's not really interested in explaining what caused that initial deviant act. It just assumes that all of us commit deviant acts at some point or another. So that doesn't even really need explaining because we all do it. They're trying to explain instead the consequences of having been labeled as a deviant. derived from labeling theory is a body of research conducted by John Braithwaite. He applies some of these labeling theories ideas to his concept of shaming. He distinguishes between two types of shaming, disintegrative shaming and reintegrative shaming. He's basically arguing that shaming can be either productive or counterproductive. Disintegrative shaming focuses on stigmatizing the deviant. It's counterproductive in the sense that it can create secondary deviance. It does not necessarily reform or rehabilitate the person who is shamed in a stigmatizing manner. Braithwaite argues that there is another type of shaming, reintegrative shaming, that is more productive. Here we're focusing on forgiveness, love, and respect for the deviant. We acknowledge that all of us commit deviant acts from time to time, and perhaps we don't need to stigmatize people who commit deviant acts, but rather reform them. Reintegrative shaming is an attempt to bring them back into society and make them productive members. So stigmatizing shaming or disintegrative shaming uses formal punishment, which can degrade a person's bond to his community. Contrast that with reintegrative shaming, where people might atone for their crime by performing community service, which helps reintegrate them into the community and hopefully creates a greater bond between them and the community. If you'll recall from bond theory, people who feel more closely tied to their community and to other people are less likely to offend. A team of criminologists, Sykes and Matza, identified 5 techniques of neutralization. Five techniques of neutralization. And they did it in the context of studying juvenile delinquents back in the 1950s. But these techniques of neutralization apply to anybody who commits a deviant act, including yourself, and even to corporations and countries. Let's look at the 5 techniques, and then we'll look at the implications of those. The first is denial of responsibility. This technique involves shifting the blame for a deviant act away from the deviant actor. I'm going to give you some examples. Well, I know she's only 6 years old, but every time she would come over, she would sit on my knee and wiggle about. It was her that was seducing me. I'm denying responsibility for my deviant act by shifting it onto somebody else. Denial of an injury. This technique involves the offender's claim that no real offense occurred because there wasn't really anybody who got harmed. So I might acknowledge that I took somebody's car without asking their permission, but he got the car back and the insurance covered the damage, so there wasn't really any injury. So therefore, what I did wasn't really so bad. The third technique, denial of a victim. Well, I guess I did smash a grapefruit in her face, but I was drunk and she kept nagging me, so she basically had it coming. She's not really a victim because she deserved what she had coming. The fourth technique, condemning the condemners. Who are you to label me as a deviant when you commit deviant acts yourself? You've done things just as bad as me. Who are you to label me as a deviant? And the fifth technique, an appeal to higher loyalties. So this technique elevates the offender's moral integrity by claiming altruistic motives. Well, yeah, I stole the money, but I needed it to pay for my grandmother's surgery. So isn't that really more important? Or yeah, I beat up those guys, but they were threatening my friends and I had to back up my friends. Isn't that really the most important thing? So what you can see here in these 5 techniques that the juvenile delinquents used was an attempt to resist the deviant label. So this is related to related to labeling theory, and these are techniques that people use to neutralize or to reject deviant labels that other people might attempt to place on them. A principle from psychology that you might recall from Intro to Psychology is cognitive dissonance. What happens when your behavior and your beliefs contradict? What happens when you think of yourself as a good person and not a criminal, but you are actually doing things that are illegal? This creates a condition of cognitive dissonance when we have this contradiction in your behavior and beliefs. Most people will adjust their beliefs to match their behavior. Techniques of neutralization are ways that you can adjust your beliefs to justify your deviant behavior and thereby reduce your cognitive dissonance. And in so doing, reduce any feelings of shame that you might experience for having committed that deviant act. Note that techniques of neutralization are a form of self-labeling. In other words, I'm rejecting deviant labels that other people are trying to place on me, and instead I'm relabeling myself as a good person for one of these 5 reasons. And I mentioned at the beginning of this that corporations will do the same thing. I've seen that myself. For example, corporations that have smokestacks that are putting cancer-causing pollutants in the air will use these techniques. And let me show you how that happens. Denial of responsibility. Well, we didn't intend to put those cancer-causing chemicals in the air. There was an accident. It was an act of God. We're not really responsible. Denial of injury. Well, you can't show that your cancer is caused by our chemicals from our smokestack. You could have got cancer for some other reason. Or maybe you didn't get cancer at all. Denial of the victim. Well, if you didn't want to breathe cancer-causing chemicals, why did you move into a house right next to our plant? Condemning the condemners. Who are you to say that our plant is a criminal plant? Don't you cheat on your taxes and do all these other things? Appeal to higher loyalties. This is my favorite one. Well, our plant may produce cancer-causing chemicals from our smokestacks, but we provide jobs for the community. And isn't that really more important? The appeal to higher loyalties. And finally, let's look at the policy implications. Before we get to that, let's look at the research challenges in labeling theory. Now, you'll have noticed that I did not make a research exercise for you for this unit, and that is because it's very difficult to measure the stigmatizing effect of a label. And how do you measure the secondary deviance? How do you measure the effects of stigmatization on recidivism or secondary deviance? So because of the challenges in measuring the concepts associated with social reaction theories, we do not have strong empirical evidence in support of these theories. Now, to say this does not mean that these theories are wrong. It just means it's difficult to assess them empirically. Nonetheless, they became very popular in the 1960s and 70s and had quite a profound influence on policy, probably more policy influence than the empirical basis warrants. And the policies that derive from this body of theory has become known as the 4D revolution. So the attempt here is to try to find ways in the criminal justice system of dealing with deviant actors that don't overly stigmatize those actors, because we're trying to minimize the amount of secondary deviance that might occur as a consequence of stigmatization. So the first D is diversion. So this refers to efforts to avoid stigmatizing juvenile offenders by diverting them from formal probation to informal voluntary programs. It can also refer to the extension of probation programs in the adult system to keep adult offenders away from the hardening effects of imprisonment. So if you are ever arrested and prosecuted for a criminal act, your best hope is probably to request some form of diversion, either probation or some other type of program uh, other than being prosecuted and imprisoned. Juvenile diversion programs increased in the 1970s. Critics of these programs argue that they might have actually pulled more people into the criminal justice system than may have been there without these programs. This is called the net widening. In other words, if I'm a judge and I know that this offender before me can either go to prison or go into diversion, I may be more likely to come down hard on him because I know he'll get diversion, which is not as bad. So more people might be pulled into the system who might have been let go otherwise, but they're now in the system because of these less intrusive diversion programs. This is called the net widening. And the net widening meaning bringing more people into the criminal justice system. And this happens by adding another component to the court system, so that cases that formerly may have been dismissed now are processed by the system. The second D is due process. This refers to the legal revolution in the 1960s that greatly extended the rights of criminal defendants. So during this period, the 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court extended due process rights to juveniles who did not have due process rights before. Labeling theory cannot take the credit for the due process revolution, but it did provide much of the theoretical justification for it. Third D is decriminalization. It refers to efforts to restrict the reach of the criminal justice system by legalizing behaviors that may previously have been illegal. So abortion and pornography became legal in the early 1970s. Prior to that, getting an abortion or creating or owning pornography would have been a criminal offense. And of course, this extends to drug laws as well. We're seeing drugs that formerly were illegal now being decriminalized, meaning they're either being made legal or the penalties are being made minimum, or the penalties are now for these drugs are now misdemeanors rather than felonies. And the fourth D is deinstitutionalization. This refers to the movement to remove prison inmates and mental patients from institutions and place them in community care, such as halfway houses and so forth. So this movement led to the expansion of probation services and community mental health clinics and halfway houses. Those are the policy implications of labeling theory. The only policy implication of neutralization theory is that, remember the techniques of neutralization, the only policy that I can think of that derives from neutralization theory is that criminal justice agents who are charged with managing offenders should strongly challenge their excuse making. If offenders come to truly believe their own rationalizations for their deviant behavior, this makes rehabilitative efforts more difficult. These offenders must be shown that their thinking patterns have negative long-term consequences for them. But for the most part, neutralization theory and reintegrative shaming have not been seriously implemented in the United States, but they have been implemented in other nations. Reintegrative shaming especially has been successful in some of the Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, and so forth. But we have little experience of it here in the United States.